be available on the website for anybody who wants to go back and refer to that. I would tell you that things are changing very, very quickly. I was on a call this afternoon at 3 o'clock with the Chester County Department of Health to get some clarification on some of those guidelines. There were some guidelines that came out last week from the Pennsylvania Department of Health and the governor's office. They are a little bit different than what the Chester County Department of Health guidelines say about in this particular topic of wearing masks, and I'll walk through that in just a minute. I also will say this again as I guess my sales pitch and my disclaimer that I reserve the right to change things because it's changing so quickly, and as we vet some things tonight, they may change tomorrow or in a couple of days with new guidelines. I understand that the CDC is also expected to release some guidelines later this week with regard to opening of schools. So we will certainly get those and take a look at those guidelines and see if there's anything new or different that our health department may want to recommend as we again plan for the opening of school. With the way that things are changing in several states, I know we got an order from 15 states. If someone has traveled in one of those 15 states, there is a mandatory 14-day self-quarantine. So that's something that not only schools are dealing with, but businesses in the state of Pennsylvania. That's a Pennsylvania order. That is not a federal order. That is a Pennsylvania order. And we're trying to keep up with all of that as things go forward. So with that, let me share my screen. Our agenda for this evening, I'll go over, again, our rules for engagement, just a brief overview of the problem, some essential questions for our task force members for tonight. Our topic is guidelines for masks, primarily for masks. There was some temperature taking discussion, but I think a lot of our discussion will be centered around masks tonight. We'll do that in the breakout sessions. Just a reminder, again, our rules for engagement. I did see the Phillies schedule came out today, so baseball analogy again, and looks like we're going to at least see some baseball this summer. But be respectful of everybody's comments. Again, there's a lot of people who want to speak. We may have differing opinions, so just be respectful of all of those opinions as we try to hear as many people as possible. So allow airtime. Please don't dominate a discussion. And again, with smaller groups, I think we'll be able to get to more people tonight than in some of those larger group sessions. We want to stay focused on our task tonight, again, looking at some of the guidelines, particularly for wearing of masks as we open up our school year. And finally, expect non-closure because, again, things are changing rapidly as we continue to plan for this. Again, our goal is to have a plan to our school board by July 27th. The Department of Ed requires that of each school board to approve a health and safety plan for what's called phased reopening of schools. Again, part of our plan is as we look at whatever guidelines we finalize, will be to have some split schedules the first 4 days with half the kids coming in on days 1 and 3 and half the kids on days 2 and 4. Just so we can work through some of those guidelines and procedures with our kids. A lot of different direction from the State Department of Education, State Department of Health, and actually superintendents in the state, I will tell you, have requested a meeting with the Secretary of Health for the state, just to try to get some clear guidance rather than have every district come up with their own plans. Each district is working with its local Department of Health. Again, there are only 6 counties out of the 67 with the Department of Health. We do have one in Chester County, and we are working closely with Gene Kasner, who's the director of the Chester County Department of Health, to help us with guidance as we look at opening our schools as safely as possible for our students, our staff, and our parents. 6 feet of social distancing, again, is a big concern that if we have to do a mandatory 6 feet of social distancing for anything, that we just would not fit all the kids in at one time. Our County Department of Health says that we can use 3 feet of social distancing, that there is definitely mitigation factors when you go to 3 feet in terms of bringing students in. But looks like we are going to now be required to wear masks almost all of the time in school with some of that new guidance. But we can still get all the kids in, we believe, with 3 feet of social distancing. And again, we want to open our schools as safely as possible in the fall. Some of the subcommittees, just to review some of the questions. The athletics group met at 5:30. They are still working, waiting for some PIA guidelines. There have been some NCAA groups that have come out, some leagues that have canceled their fall events and their fall schedules. So as the NCAA starts to do that, I'm sure that the high school groups will begin to look at some of those guidelines. We have not gotten official word on that, but that group is teasing that out and working through that as they get new information. Transportation, our transportation group sent out something this week to try to get at least an early signs of how many people would be willing to drive their children to school. So we're trying to get some early data on that so we can begin to build those transportation schedules. That's not something that we can do in just a couple of weeks because it's very complicated. For those of you that have heard me talk about our transportation magnitude of how we bus kids, we do transport to over 160 different schools every day, not just our 16 public schools, but some 145 private and parochial and charter schools as well. So we have to coordinate all of those services with all of those other schools in addition to our 16 schools. The staff and parent committees, again, are looking at some things with regard to masking and some social distancing. Our staff committees earlier also worked on some schedules for remote learning. Part of our plan also will have to include, if there is another governor-ordered shutdown of our schools, what will our remote learning look like? So we are revising remote learning. We are working with our staff on teasing out those schedules to give it more structure, yet also flexibility, because it is very difficult if we're all placed back in a shutdown. Parents need some flexibility, staff needs some flexibility, yet kids need the structure of a school day. So that is something that we are working on with our staff committees. And our special area committees, again, are working with how do some of those special areas work in the special rooms, such as PE, art, and the library. Taking temperatures, the superintendents in Chester County, as I said, we did meet with the Chester County Department of Health today for an update. And this is where I think we're landing with regard to the Westchester plan for taking temperatures, that we are going to require all staff and students to be screened at home, have our staff and our parents sign a waiver that they will be taking temperatures and that they will keep their children home, and our staff will stay home if in fact they are sick. We want to try to mitigate through that process. There are some people that we had some discussion about that at some of the staff committee levels. How do we get thermometers in the hands of people if they don't have them? There's some things we can do for that. Parents and staff, well, again, we'll ask to sign a commitment letter to monitor those temperatures and stay home. So that will be another form that we'll be sending out this fall. Any visitors that are coming to the school, they will be required to have temperature checks. That is a Chester County Department of Health guideline. So we're gonna follow that guideline, and we will make sure that visitors make an appointment or have called ahead of time so that we know they're coming, and do temperature screenings for any visitors for whatever reason they may be there. We will also conduct periodic temperature checks for any of the high-risk students. This is something that's in the Department of Health guidelines. So if there are some students that may be high risk for getting sick, we will monitor them throughout the day. We will be doing some temperature checks for the students, and if there are staff that are part of that as well.
No,
we will do that.
Sorry, in small, she's fine, like in small.
For face coverings, and we did clarify with the Department of Health today that face coverings can be a plastic shield or a clear shield, or it can be the actual face mask. The best is obviously both. when you look at CDC guidelines, but for our purposes, we can use face coverings in terms of a shield or a mask. So on July 1st, the Department of Health ordered face coverings for all people over the age of 2 in all public places. In fact, that information came out last week just as we were beginning our breakout meetings for talking about social distancing. There's some clarification from the Chester County Department of Health and the guidance for schools. That came out on July 3rd, on Friday, and again, we did get clarification today on that. In schools, the face coverings or masks are not required if we can get 6 feet of social distancing that can be achieved, or we are working alone in a workspace. In terms of how that goes for face coverings. The masks they are required if you can't get 6 feet of social distancing. And again, our classrooms are not going to be set up with 6 feet. So that means we are going to require all staff and students to be wearing masks or face coverings while they are in the classroom. And then bus drivers also are going to be required operating a bus with students on board to have a face covering in place as well. So here will be the guidelines that we'll put in our plan, and this is what we want to talk about tonight to vet this. So all staff can wear masks. We'll wear masks or face shields, except if they're working alone in a workstation, eating lunch, which is part of the county guidelines as well, and also part of the state guidelines, or if there's a medical reason to not wear a mask or a face shield, that will require a doctor's note for that reason. All of our secondary students will be wearing masks. We'll require them to wear masks and face shields at all times, again, unless they are eating lunch. We currently have more than 6 feet of social distancing can be achieved, which in our big middle and high schools, I don't know that there'll be too many times when that will happen. Some of the talk about our staff groups where they don't want to be the 6 foot police, where some kids may test that. We may in fact just have all of our secondary kids wear masks all the times unless they're eating lunch or they are alone in a room. But we're still vetting that. All elementary students wear masks or face shields, again, unless eating lunch. More than 6 feet of social distancing can be achieved. The Chester County Department of Health does say mask breaks should be scheduled, and our teachers are working on how we would do that. Those are currently where we are with our guidelines that we'll put into our plan, and we want to get some feedback on that tonight. We have remote learning schedules. We'll call this Remote Learning 2.0. Our staff groups, we're working on that earlier tonight. These are the guidelines, and it's just now in school code that we must have a 180-day schedule for remote learning. So kids have to log in 180 days, 900 hours of instruction at elementary, 990 at secondary. And that's a combination of synchronous learning with the teacher face-to-face and asynchronous learning where there's some online work that's done by students. And it will be a combination of synchronous and asynchronous. Again, we are trying to find that balance between giving more structure from what we did in the spring and also having some flexibility. This is different, by the way, than our cyber program, which we are already taking some registrations for our cyber program for the secondary schools. And we'll be sending out some information next week about the elementary cyber program. Parents can choose the cyber program option. That is a primarily asynchronous schedule. There's lots of flexibility in that schedule. There is a lot of follow-up with the teachers in terms of work that's being posted through discussion boards, videos that are posted. So the cyber program is very different. That is more of an asynchronous program, and that will be offered to parents if they choose not to bring the kids in with some of the regulations that we put in to bring kids into school. That's different than Remote Learning 2.0 if the governor shuts us down. Just so we're going to try to, over the next few weeks, make clarifications for that. Questions for tonight, essential questions. So So as we look at temperature taking and wearing a mask, what are the challenges at each level with regard to these face coverings and temperature taking? How will we make these face coverings work? Because it looks like we are now going to require that for all or most of the time in school for staff and students. And what considerations do we need to give to our implementation teams to implement these guidelines? And then what can we do to make it easier for students? I know our staff groups had some very creative ways to try to make it more fun for kids and be role models for the kids as well. And again, the staff groups were talking about some of the scheduling tonight. That was part of their task for tonight. Before we go into breakout sessions, I want to we had some questions in the chat. We can try to get some of those. There's lots. I mean, if there's feedback in here, we will make some copies of these notes to add them to our notes if we don't get to that in some of the breakout rooms. Some questions about guidance. As guidance is changing, yes, that is true. So as we get to some of these questions in the breakout rooms, we will try to capture those with the larger group again when we come back into the main group. With that, I will ask Chris Cromwell or Mary Beth Clifton and Michael Wagener, our tech support, to get people into the breakout sessions. Again, when we will spend about an hour in those sessions, and then we'll come back and debrief and try to answer some of the questions with the larger group. All right. And, a lot of very good discussion, lots of great ideas going around, and a lot of people who've had kids with experiencing masks. I have both of my kids have this summer had to wear masks, certainly where they go out in public and other places. So it's kids are starting to get used to it, but not the best way to operate a school. But again, it may be our new normal at least to start this school year. So thank you so much for being part of all of that. I did take a look at some of the questions that were put in the chat prior to going to the breakouts. I'll address some of those, and then we'll do a brief summary of the feedback from each of the subcommittee groups. There was questions about the cyber program, asynchronous versus synchronous. I'll ask Michael Wagener, our Director of Instructional Technology, to just address that briefly. Michael?
Yes, sure. There really are two online options that will be available. I want to talk a little bit very briefly about the cyber program, because that is a program that is part of our district comprehensive plan, the framework of which was in place long before the COVID-19 pandemic. The teachers in that program have been highly trained to teach in that environment. The families that are opting into it tend to know the nuances of a cyber program, and it's really designed to be a competitive alternative to cyber charter schools, backed by the resources of the school district. It is mostly asynchronous, meaning that students work at their own pace. That is really a method or a strategy to allow students with diverse schedules and needs to take their schooling in a way that's conducive to a schedule that may not be the norm or the traditional schedule for the vast majority of students. We have to do it that way in order to be a competitive alternative. However, I do want to stress that there are many opportunities built in for synchronous, in other words, live instruction between the teachers and the students. And there is a lot of attention to building the educational learning culture and environment within that framework, in addition to access to all of the all of the school resources, and quite possibly taking some classes in brick and mortar. So that's the one. That's the one option, and it would have been an option regardless of COVID-19. The difference is our rollout, our implementation is a lot more compressed than we had originally anticipated. So we'll be offering more grade levels. Actually, we'll be offering K-12, which was not the original intent. The second option, assuming we go into red again, is what I guess we would call the remote learning 2.0. So it will look a lot different than what students and families experienced in the spring, based on the feedback we received, based on opportunities to do professional development with our staff. But that will really mirror as closely as possible the actual brick and mortar schedule, and it will be a lot more opportunities than in the spring, and certainly more opportunities than in the cyber program for synchronous scheduled instruction. And again, its intention and design is different than our cyber program. So it's remote learning 2.0. If we are in red, and the cyber program, those would be in addition to, obviously and hopefully getting close to a normal school experience.
Okay, thanks, Michael. Another question that was in the chat before we broke about temperature checks and screening, that the Department of Health has guidelines. Yes, they do. That is something that, again, our nurses have been working very closely with the Department of Health. And those are guidelines that we certainly need to send out to our parents in terms of what to look for illness of students. The temperatures are not the only sign of this virus. So that is not a foolproof way to determine if somebody is sick. It does mean there is some infection. It doesn't mean it's a COVID-19. Also, with the temperature checks, people were putting some comments in there. We can't trust the parents that they're not going to do it. This is an all hands on deck epidemic, and we have got to rally around our kids and our schools and trust that people are going to do their part. If we find we do have the right to do some temperature checks, Department of Health recommends for some of the high-risk kids and staff that we do those periodic checks and keep an eye on them. But we certainly can do the checks if we find out that parents are not. But it's something that we've got to stress very, very heavily with our parents to help out, to help prevent any spread and get some mitigation of this virus. Workstation definition, there was a question about that. What's defined as a workstation? I use that as it's an area where anybody is working or eating. I mean, anywhere that they are, if they're alone, that becomes a work area. I don't want to mean it to be a specific just that we have to go do work, but it's an area where you can get the separation and distance. Some of our instructional planning centers for teachers, for example, they may be 1 or 2 people in those planning centers on a planning period, which would certainly give them the ability to social distance 6 feet or more. If we downgrade, can we change the guidance? That is a great question, and I will tell you that yes, if there's a downgrade, if there's all of a sudden a vaccine or cure, that may change the guidance that we're going to get. We work closely with the Chester County Department of Health to get interpretations of guidance. So yes, as that changes, so can change our plan. I'm finding that through this process, that in our planning process, we need to be flexible and nimble. I think in our implementation process, we're going to also need to be flexible and nimble as things change. So short answer, yes, we can change as the circumstances change. Someone had about plexiglass to student stations. It's not we haven't looked at the plexi. Well, we did look at the cost of the plexiglass to put it around all of our desks. Again, there's about 10,000 desks in the district we'd have to do. It's very expensive. We did look at the portable type clear stations, which kids can put up as folders. They can keep them. They're washable. So that's something that we are looking at. We did order some of those to try to check those out. The kids keep them with them as they go from class to class, and they are theirs, not sharing with anybody else. Change in attendance policies. There was a question about that. Would we change the attendance policies? We did do that during remote shutdown 1.0 in the spring, and we would probably do that again, which would give parents. We're encouraging parents to keep kids home when they're sick. Additional opportunities to do parent notes for sickness in our policy. So yes, we would make those changes. Are the masks required? Someone asked about are they required? They are currently required under the order, and I'm sure there were some places that began where it wasn't required. If you got some certain social distancing, that you could have them as an option or recommended, but they are now required. If that changes, we certainly would change with our guidelines as well. And some questions about, are we going to go test all of our staff and our teachers? We have not said that we're going to do that. It's something we've started to talk about, but it's not something that we have said, nor have we put it in our plan yet in terms of testing our teachers. So with that, those were the questions that were in the chat earlier. Let's do a brief summary with the groups. The elementary group, let's start with them. There were two of those, I believe, 2 breakout groups for elementary. So we can start with elementary 1, and then if there's something to add, we'll jump to elementary 2.
Yeah, so elementary 1, I think everybody in the group is trying to balance the reality that they want their kids back in school with the mandates and realizing that nothing's going to be ideal, but how do we make it as good as possible? I think one of the biggest concerns was just the length of time students may have to wear a mask in a day. Especially for the younger students, K1, 2, not only for just the physical reality of fidgeting, playing with it, they become dirty, they drop them, but also the social emotional, not being able to see faces and their mental health of the students. And looking for, considering alternative spaces, even if it's just periodic for longer breaks in the day, whether it be larger classrooms on nice days being outside, but trying to consider all the different options so that there could be stretches of time where they didn't have to wear the masks. Also talked about, like anything else, building routines and helping parents understand things they could probably do in the weeks leading up to the school year to build not only stamina, but also the understanding of wearing them for longer periods of time. And some creative ways that we could possibly do that by, as a district, providing videos or maybe even school-based videos, fun different ways, social stories, maybe even contests, somehow a day in the life of the mask or a day in the life of the face shield, and kind of taking them through what the day is going to look like so they can be prepared when they come in. We also talked a bit about temperature taking, and while we might start off strong as parents, taking those temperature checks every day, is it really feasible or reasonable to think that stamina is going to be there for the parent to do it day to day? Are there different ways that we can maybe have that happen? Are there apps available? Is there something that a parent could register the temperature in Power School possibly on a daily basis to get those temperatures checked? Yeah, and I think that was it, was trying to just come up with alternatives and trying to have different ways to have students make it through a long day with those masks.
Okay, yeah. Thanks, Nora. How about anything else to add from the second elementary group?
Yeah, well, Dr. Wheeler, you covered a lot. It's amazing how 2 separate groups come up with some really great ideas. A lot of things came out with the same positive, just moving forward. And I think the biggest theme that I heard Dr. Wheeler say that came out of our group was the really just putting more information in the hands of the parents as we prepare for the start of the school year, trying to give them ideas and resources on what to do, building that stamina of their kids to wear the masks. Just really, really communicating and trying to be as positive as we can to help our little ones start off the year as positive as we can. Just some general concerns they had were with, they mentioned apps, having Google Forms, so parents do the checklist that they have in some of the camps now this summer. Concern that, maybe parents might not have access to a thermometer, might not do temperature checks every day. Sometimes morning life can be very busy. What if they come from somewhere else, like grandparents' house, childcare facilities? The concern with wearing masks, that's come up in a lot of the other areas too, is in buildings that don't have AC. But again, the consideration of using a larger space to separate them, using the air-conditioned space that some of the buildings do have, even though the whole building's not air-conditioned. Again, going back to what Nora said, just really being proactive and rewarding these kids, making it a positive experience, a school-wide positive behavior plan, using those, rewarding kids, acknowledging them when they are following the guidelines and wearing the masks. And then just the considerations of keeping it as fun as we can. Mask breaks will be important. Encouraging parents to make it positive, clear masks, and just they were the highlights. Some really good ideas and really good suggestions, but also some very good valid concerns that I'm sure will be addressed. So I appreciate their feedback. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks, Steve. And again, our implementation teams will continue to meet after next week to put everything together and make sure we can get our schools up and running as safely as possible. So thanks, Steve and Nora, for the elementary summary. How about middle school summary? I think we had 2 groups at middle school as well. But the middle school 1 group.
I'll go, Dr. Scanlon.
Thanks, Judy.
No problem. So, when we looked at the middle school, we figured our kids were a little bit older, and the concern was how many parents are still at home when middle school students are leaving to come to school. So there was some concerns about putting the onus of taking the temperature with the families. So there was discussion about possibly the community taking more of an active role, possibly doing temperature checks at the bus stop. Someone suggested also doing it at the cars, that kind of thing. So there's definitely some concerns about when temperatures will be taken. There's also a question as to why can't we do it in the homeroom? The other thing that came up was our attendance policy, and students are expected, if they have a temperature, are we asking students to come out for 24 hours, which is typical of the rule, or are they going to be out for 14 days? And if that's the case, what are we going to be putting in place for those students? Are they going to have access to remote learning? And what does that remote learning look like? Are they going to be able to Zoom in? What is going to be available to those students at that point? Then we started looking at the mask, and parents really are concerned about middle school students having masks on all day. And are we putting in place some multiple breaks during the day? Possibly some more outdoor learning with and when the weather permits, but definitely more breaks. We found our group was a little torn. There were some people who felt like maybe students shouldn't really be wearing masks at the middle school level once they're in the classroom. And then there were others that were saying, if the teacher's the only person wearing the mask, are we really protecting everyone? So that mask was pretty big for us.
Okay, thanks, Judy. Some sounds like some very good discussion in middle school group 1. John, how about middle school 2? You're in there. You want to summarize that one? You got to unmute, Sean.
Sorry, thank you. A lot of the same things were coming out of our group as well. I think the biggest was, as far as challenges, has been mentioned with the other middle school group as well as the elementary, which is the parents, having the responsibility of taking the student temperatures at home. And is that the best solution? Are there any alternatives? And then also students forgetting their masks at home, as we know, typical middle school fashion style. So we talked about some possible solutions to that as well. Another challenge, have we thought about absences of the staff, which I know we have talked about as well. How are we going to accommodate the needs of the students if we run into that issue? If we have high levels of staff that are showing symptoms or have fevers and a high number of absences. The other biggest challenge that was brought up a few different times was the anxiety of the students, and just the mental health was, I think, a common theme throughout. How are the students going to be when they return? What can we do to relieve some of that anxiety, and be sure not to instill fear in the students as well and make it a welcoming environment. So some of the things about how we make it successful, we talked about having extra masks on hand for students that do forget their masks on occasion. There was also an idea about alternating. Maybe a student will have a mask in the hallway, but then if they had a shield that they put on in the classroom, that might be a way that would make it more successful for them, because then they're not just wearing the mask all day. And also something that I saw was the mask breaks throughout the day. I know that was mentioned at elementary as well, but some parents thought that that might be a good idea, that we build those in as well, some breaks from the mask throughout the day. And then considerations for implementing the guidelines. A few were that that there is no mandate by the state to provide evidence if a student does not need to wear a mask. So how we handle those situations. And also, which I know came up last week, about the block scheduling, to limit, or some sort of creative scheduling, just to limit the exposure, even with the masks in the hallways. How do we limit those exposure? And so some ideas were also partnering with the CCIU and Westchester University, some of the programs there to support the students and the staff, and also maybe as a district coming up with some tricks or tips or a checklist for parents on how they can work with the students at home and what they can do to support us at home as well. And I think the biggest, about making it easier that came up, the last thing was just the way we message it to the students when they return to school, and how important that is, that we message it correctly, that we're educating the students on what to expect and why. This is the expectation, but also, there's a greater purpose here to keep everyone, your loved ones healthy, the community healthy, et cetera. And really the way we go about presenting it to the students is going to be crucial.
I think that's a great point. I know our staff earlier had some discussions about how to model for the kids and be a positive influence for the kids in the classroom. So yeah, good topics. Thanks, Judy and Sean.
Sure.
How about our high school groups? We have a high school one. Want to summarize?
Yeah. Hey, Jim, this is Kevin Fagan. So I don't want to be too redundant. It sounds like the conversations at each of the levels was actually pretty similar. A number of these topics came up in our conversation as well, in terms of taking temperature at home and putting the onus of that on the students and on the families. And I suppose at the high school level, the students would play a more active role in that process. What would that look like? And how do we get buy-in from our families to ensure that they're actually doing that? One of the medical professionals in our group pointed out that temperature taking alone is not all inclusive when it comes to COVID-19, that there are other symptoms that we'd also need to consider. And there are checklists out there that would help families to, sort of go through those priorities so they knew whether their child was sick or not. And then there were questions about how would the school be notified about that, and how long would that student be out of school, and what documentation would they need in order to return to school safely. Pros and cons for wearing masks. The first thing we talked about was the fact that, the kids really want to be back in school. They want to be back with their peers. They want to be back with their teachers. And that's a great starting point from us. And trying to build on that momentum and getting buy-in from the students early is going to be really important. And getting families on board is going to be really important as well. The conversation did come up, however, about, what do you do with students who refuse to wear masks? They just don't want to, and it's a compliance issue. And, what will be the school district's response to a situation like that? We talked about, a little bit off topic, but sort of under this category as well, the need for, providing students with instruction for cleaning their hands throughout the course of the day and making sure that they're keeping their hands clean, almost just as important as wearing a mask all day. We discussed the question of what happens with students and families who travel to one of those 15 states or who travel out of the country. How will they notify the school and the school district that they have traveled to one of those places? And then what will expectations be for quarantine or keeping their children out of school? And then the last thing, in terms of making this easier for students, as my colleagues have already mentioned, trying to focus on the positive, trying to build on the momentum of getting kids back in school and the fact that they want to be in school, getting them involved in the process, and trying to use those first few days of school to make it fun, get buy-in from them and get them invested in keeping everyone safe and keeping everyone at school for as long as we can.
Thanks, Kevin. Yeah, I think the high school students, particularly the upperclassmen, can be good role models for the underclassmen, and that'd be a good strategy. So thanks for that summary from the high school group. Pupil services, I think we had 2 groups there. We have a pupil services 1.
Yes, thanks, Jim. We talked mostly about the challenges to our unique student population that has educational needs and specific needs based on behaviors, and we focused mainly on sensory issues with students wearing masks, some students that might have social skills needs, and you wouldn't have as many social cues with students and staff wearing masks. Potential increase in school avoidance and anxiety, as well as some students that have speech or hearing impairment that would also be exacerbated by they themselves wearing a mask or other folks wearing masks that they interact with. Some of the questions that we would look for a little more clarity is just some of the medical exemptions in this related to masks and students with disabilities, where those exemptions, what needs to be documented and how are students going to be identified as at risk. And then for some of the areas that we would hopeful that would make this easier for students would be to utilize social stories and videos and have parents try out a variety of face coverings over the summer, and just being clear about what is allowable in terms of a face covering, what we're looking for as a district, and having families try out what would be the most comfortable and appealing option for a student for an entire school day.
Okay, Steve, yeah, I had a chance to sit in on some of that discussion. It was a very, very good, productive discussion. So thanks, Steve. Pupil services too, I had a chance to step in there too for a little bit. Carol and Casey, I think you guys were facilitating that one. Anything to add to Steve's report? Hearing none, we will move to. Are we there?
Yeah, sorry.
Are you
Carol.
there you go.
Now I'm on. Sorry.
All right. Thanks, Carol.
I said I think Steve's group was listening in on our group. Very similar responses, almost identical. The challenges of special needs students, those kids that need those social cues, kids that are really struggling for sensory, how are we going to be able to get them to wear masks? We talked about all those challenges, and the medical exemptions came up. We talked about all the transitioning of the social emotional options. A lot of ideas were shared. We also came up with some, in addition to easier ways for making it easier for students, is kind of creating kind of fun videos for them to kind of watch about wearing a mask and hand washing, and coming up with kind of prepping them before they come in. These are the kinds of things to expect. But all the other things are very similar to the other groups. I had a good group. Thanks.
Okay. Thanks, Carol.
Mm-hmm.
And then the transportation group, I think John and Justin, you guys were facilitating the transportation group.
Yep, Jim, I have it. It's John. And it's great going last because we can just say ditto. Everything that every other group discussed in a classroom environment, we pretty much discussed in a bus environment. So we share the same concerns. The temperatures at home, how is it being monitored? If parents do not sign that waiver, will the children be allowed to ride the bus, or will we not route the students? We had a whole bunch of other discussions about temperature taking and drivers, but since that's not the route we're going down, we just kept it to, there is a concern if parents do not sign that waiver, will their children be allowed to ride a bus? As far as masks are concerned, we think that the expectations need to be out there. When the expectations are out there, what are the consequences for not following the expectations? What are we going to do for kids who don't wear a mask? Now, we're not talking about the ones that medically can't wear a mask, but the ones that either parents don't want them to wear a mask or the student refuses to wear the mask. Carol, we also did talk about the video. We actually had some good conversation about the video and went back and forth that, yes, the video for informational purposes might be right, but is wearing a mask really fun? And do we really want to be telling our kids that it's fun to wear a mask when it really isn't fun to be wearing a mask? So that's not up for debate, Carol. That was just us going back and forth within our group as to how do you relay this message out in a way that kids will wear it.
Right.
Other than that, Jim, everything that we had was pretty much the same as every other group, just in a bus environment as opposed to in a classroom.
Okay, thanks, John. Yeah, a lot of common ground and a lot of common themes throughout all the groups tonight, not only the parent groups, but the staff groups earlier this evening too. So I want to thank everybody for coming out and giving us feedback on the topic of masks. If it changes next week, I'll certainly let everybody know in terms of what the guidance and guidelines will be. We'll meet again on the 15th. At that point, I will try to break down some of the components of the plan to get some feedback on how we can help students transition with the plan that we want to bring to our school board. And then we'll go to the implementation phase, and as things adjust and change, we will keep our community and our parents and our staff and our students informed, so that we can do this very careful walk together as we head toward August 31st in terms of opening schools safely for all of our students here in Westchester. So again, I thank you for giving us feedback tonight. I look forward to seeing people and hearing people again next week. And I wish everybody a great rest of the week. And go out. I personally love the hot weather. Go out and enjoy that if you like it. And if you don't, I hope you can stay under the shade and stay cool somewhere. So thank you so much. And we'll talk with everybody next week.